Marcus Thompson stepped off the tour bus at Buckingham Palace with his phone already recording. The 28-year-old social media influencer from California had one goal that sunny Tuesday morning in London: create viral content that would boost his struggling YouTube channel. His followers had been dropping steadily, and his last few videos barely cracked 1,000 views. He needed something big, something that would get people talking. The palace grounds buzzed with tourists from around the world, all snapping photos and marveling at the grand architecture. But Marcus wasn't interested in typical tourist shots. His eyes locked onto the iconic red-uniformed guards, standing motionless at their posts. These were the famous Queen's Guards, known worldwide for their stoic discipline and refusal to break character no matter what happened around them. Marcus had seen countless videos online of tourists trying unsuccessfully to make the guards react. Most attempts were harmless: funny faces, silly dances, or loud noises. But Marcus wanted to be different. He wanted to push boundaries further than anyone had before. His competitive nature, which had served him well in college football, now drove him to seek extreme content for internet fame. He approached the nearest guard, a tall man with a perfectly groomed mustache barely visible beneath his iconic bearskin hat. The guard, Sergeant James Mitchell, had been serving the Crown for 8 years. He took immense pride in his duty and had weathered countless tourist antics with unwavering composure. His military training had prepared him for far worse than anything civilians could throw at him. Marcus started with typical tourist behavior, taking selfies near the guard and making exaggerated poses. When this failed to generate any reaction, he escalated. He began making loud comments about the guard's appearance, calling him a living statue and a tourist prop. Other visitors started gathering, some laughing nervously at Marcus's increasingly bold behavior. The young American pulled out his phone and began live streaming to his few hundred followers who happened to be online. "Watch this, guys," he said into the camera. "I'm about to make this robot guard break character." The comments started flowing in, with some viewers encouraging him to go further while others warned him to stop. Sergeant Mitchell remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Years of training had taught him to ignore distractions, no matter how persistent or annoying. He had dealt with drunk tourists, crying children, and even protesters. This brash young man was just another test of his professional discipline. But Marcus interpreted the guard's silence as a personal challenge. His father had always criticized him for giving up too easily, and his ex-girlfriend had broken up with him partly because she thought he lacked persistence. In his mind, this moment represented something bigger than just creating content. It was about proving he could succeed where others failed. He moved closer to the guard, now speaking directly at him rather than to his phone camera. "Come on, man. I know you can hear me. Just smile once, just once, and I'll leave you alone." His voice carried a mixture of playful teasing and growing frustration. The crowd around them had grown larger, with some tourists pulling out their own phones to record the confrontation. An elderly British woman in the crowd shook her head disapprovingly. "Young man, you should show some respect," she called out. But her words only seemed to fuel Marcus's determination. He had always been the type to double down when criticized, a trait that had gotten him into trouble throughout his life. Marcus began circling the guard slowly, commenting on every aspect of his uniform and appearance. He made jokes about the bearskin hat, questioned whether the rifle was real, and speculated loudly about what it would take to make the guard speak. His phone continued recording everything, and he could see his viewer count slowly climbing as words spread about his live stream. The situation was reaching a tipping point that neither Marcus nor the growing crowd fully understood. What had started as typical tourist mischief was evolving into something more serious. Sergeant Mitchell's training told him to remain calm and professional, but something about this particular tourist's persistence and disrespect was beginning to test even his legendary composure. Other guards at nearby posts had begun to take notice of the commotion. Palace security personnel were also monitoring the situation from a distance, ready to intervene if necessary. The atmosphere was shifting from lighthearted tourist fun to something more tense and unpredictable. Marcus, oblivious to the growing concern around him, continued his one-man show for his online audience. In his mind, he was just minutes away from creating the viral moment that would change his life. He had no idea how dramatically his life was indeed about to change, but not in the way he hoped. Marcus decided to escalate his tactics. The small crowd watching him had given him confidence, and the climbing viewer numbers on his live stream made him feel invincible. He moved even closer to Sergeant Mitchell, now standing just inches away from the guard's face. The smell of the guard's polished leather and wool uniform filled Marcus's nostrils as he leaned in. "I bet you're dying to scratch your nose right now," Marcus taunted, his camera phone held high to capture every angle. "Or maybe you need to use the bathroom. How long do you guys stand here without moving?" His questions grew more personal and inappropriate. Several tourists in the crowd began looking uncomfortable, with some parents pulling their children away from the scene. Sergeant Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his 8 years of service, he had developed an iron will, but this tourist was pushing boundaries that few had dared to cross. The guard's military training kicked in as he mentally recited the protocols he had memorized. Remain calm. Do not engage. Protect the dignity of the crown. But every man has his breaking point, even those trained to be unbreakable. Marcus noticed the tiny change in the guard's expression and felt a rush of excitement. "Oh, I saw that!" he shouted triumphantly into his phone. "His face moved, guys! I'm getting to him!" The comment section of his live stream exploded with reactions, some cheering him on while others begged him to stop before he got into serious trouble. Emboldened by what he perceived as victory, Marcus made a critical error in judgment. He reached out and lightly tapped the guard's ceremonial rifle. The moment his fingers made contact with the weapon, everything changed. The playful atmosphere vanished instantly, replaced by something much more serious and dangerous. Sergeant Mitchell's eyes snapped to focus directly on Marcus for the first time. His voice, when it came, was low and commanding, carrying the weight of military authority. "Step away from the weapon immediately." The words cut through the morning air like a blade, causing the entire crowd to fall silent. Marcus, startled by finally getting a reaction, made another terrible decision. Instead of backing down, he laughed nervously and reached toward the rifle. Again. "See? I told you I could make him talk," he said to his camera, not understanding the gravity of what he had just done. That second touch of the ceremonial weapon triggered immediate action. Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward, his full 6'3", frame now imposing and intimidating. His military training took over completely as he moved to secure the situation. "Sir, you are interfering with a Queen's Guard in the performance of his duty. Step back immediately or you will be detained." The crowd gasped collectively. Many tourists began backing away, sensing that something serious was happening. Parents grabbed their children and several people stopped recording, suddenly uncomfortable with witnessing what appeared to be escalating into a real confrontation. But Marcus, high on adrenaline and the attention he was receiving, made the worst decision of his life. Instead of apologizing and walking away, he squared his shoulders and moved closer to the guard. "What are you going to do about it?" he challenged, his voice now carrying genuine aggression rather than playful teasing. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Sergeant Mitchell had been trained to handle many situations, but direct challenges to his authority and interference with his equipment fell into a completely different category of response. His hand moved slightly, adjusting his grip in a way that veterans in the crowd immediately recognized as preparation for action. Marcus's live stream viewer count had jumped to over 3,000 people, the highest it had ever been. Comments flooded in faster than he could read them, but most were no longer encouraging. People were begging him to stop, warning him that he was about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. But Marcus was too caught up in the moment to pay attention to the warnings. An older man in the crowd, clearly a military veteran based on his bearing, stepped forward. "Son, you need to walk away right now," he called out urgently. "You have no idea what you're about to bring down on yourself." His voice carried the authority of someone who understood exactly how serious the situation had become. But Marcus was beyond listening to reason. The combination of his desperate need for viral fame, his lifelong pattern of escalating conflicts when challenged, and the intoxicating feeling of having an audience had created a perfect storm of bad judgment. He looked directly into Sergeant Mitchell's eyes and said the words that would change everything. "I don't think you've got the guts to do anything about it, toy soldier." The insult hit Sergeant Mitchell like a physical blow. 8 years of faithful service, countless hours of training, dedication to Queen and country, all dismissed with a casual sneer from an arrogant tourist. For the first time in his military career, his professional composure cracked completely. The guard's response was swift and decisive. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward and placed his hand firmly on Marcus's chest, pushing him back with controlled force. "You are now under citizen's arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces and interference with official duties," he announced in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. Marcus stumbled backward, his phone clattering to the ground as shock replaced his earlier confidence. The reality of what he had just triggered began to dawn on him, but it was far too late to take back his words or actions. Palace security officers were already moving through the crowd toward them, their radios crackling with urgent communications. The palace security officers arrived within seconds, their black uniforms and serious expressions making it clear that this was no longer a tourist spectacle. Marcus found himself surrounded by 3 armed officers, while Sergeant Mitchell maintained his position, now clearly in control of the situation he had been forced to escalate. "Sir, please place your hands where we can see them," commanded the lead security officer, a woman in her 40s whose calm professionalism contrasted sharply with Marcus's growing panic. Her name tag read Inspector Davies, and her no-nonsense demeanor immediately told Marcus that his usual charm and excuses would be useless here. Marcus's hands shook as he raised them. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 100 people, all recording with their phones and whispering among themselves. He could see his own phone on the ground, still live streaming to his audience, but now capturing his humiliation rather than his triumph. "This is all a misunderstanding," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking with stress. "I was just making a video. I'm a content creator. I didn't mean anything by it." The excuses poured out of him desperately, but Inspector Davies remained unmoved as she gestured for him to turn around. "Sir, you are being detained for questioning regarding interference with official duties and assault on a member of the armed forces," she stated clearly, producing a set of plastic restraints. "You have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to legal representation." The reality of his situation crashed over Marcus like a cold wave. This wasn't just about making a viral video anymore. He was actually being arrested in a foreign country, at one of the most famous landmarks in the world, with hundreds of people recording everything. As the restraints clicked into place around his wrists, Marcus felt his knees go weak. The adrenaline that had fueled his reckless behavior now worked against him, making his heart race and his vision blur slightly. He looked desperately at the faces in the crowd, hoping to see sympathy or support, but found only a mixture of disappointment and second-hand embarrassment. Sergeant Mitchell, now that the situation was under control, returned to his post with professional efficiency. But something had changed in his demeanor. The incident had clearly affected him more than his training typically allowed. Other guards would later say they had never seen him look so personally insulted by a tourist's behavior. Inspector Davies began walking Marcus toward a security vehicle that had pulled up nearby. With each step, the weight of his actions became heavier. He thought about his parents back in California, who had already been disappointed by his dropping out of college to pursue social media fame. This would devastate them. Please, Marcus said quietly to Inspector Davies as they walked. I know I messed up. I know I was wrong. Can't we just forget about this? I'll delete the video. I'll apologize publicly, whatever you want. His voice had lost all its earlier cockiness, replaced by genuine desperation. Inspector Davies glanced at him with something that might have been pity. Sir, once you physically interfered with a Queen's Guard and his equipment, this became a matter for the courts to decide, not something that can be handled with apologies. Her tone was not unkind, but it was absolutely firm. As they reached the security vehicle, Marcus caught sight of his phone still on the ground where he had dropped it. The live stream was still running, and he could see the comment counter spinning, wildly as thousands of people shared their reactions to what they had just witnessed. Many comments expressed disbelief that he had been so stupid, while others shared warnings about the serious legal consequences he now faced. A palace maintenance worker picked up the phone and ended the live stream before handing it to another, security officer. Marcus watched his only connection to his online world disappear, symbolizing how completely his digital persona had just self-destructed in the most public way possible. The crowd began to disperse as Marcus was placed in the back of the security vehicle, but many tourists continued filming and discussing what they had witnessed. Some expressed sympathy for the young American, while others felt he had gotten exactly what he deserved for his disrespectful behavior. As the vehicle pulled away from Buckingham Palace, Marcus stared out the window at the magnificent building where his life had just taken its most dramatic turn. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had finally created the viral moment he desperately wanted, but it was documenting his own downfall rather than his success. Inspector Davies sat across from him in the vehicle, filling out paperwork with methodical precision. "Where are you staying in London?" she asked without looking up. "A hostel in Camden," Marcus replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The contrast between his current situation and his earlier loud, attention-seeking behavior was stark. "Is there anyone we should contact? Family, friends, legal representation?" Marcus thought about this question seriously for the first time. His parents would be horrified. His few real friends back home would probably see this as the inevitable result of his increasingly desperate attempts at internet fame. He had no money for legal representation, and his travel insurance probably didn't cover criminal charges. "I don't know," he admitted, the full scope of his isolation becoming clear to him. His pursuit of online popularity had cost him many real relationships, and now, when he needed support most, he found himself completely alone in a foreign country, facing charges he didn't fully understand. The police station in central London was nothing like the dramatic TV shows Marcus had watched growing up. It was sterile, bureaucratic, and overwhelmingly serious. As he sat in the holding area, still wearing the clothes he had put on that morning, expecting just another day of sightseeing, the reality of his situation continued to sink in deeper. Detective Sarah Williams, a veteran officer with 15 years of experience handling tourist-related incidents, sat down across from Marcus in the interview room. Her expression was professional, but not unkind, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen every possible variation of human foolishness. "Mr. Thompson," she began, opening a thick file folder. "Let's start from the beginning. What were you hoping to accomplish today at Buckingham Palace?" Marcus stared at his hands, now free from restraints, but somehow feeling heavier than ever. "I just wanted to make a good video," he said quietly. "My channel hasn't been doing well, and I thought if I could get one of the guards to react, it would help my numbers." Detective Williams nodded, making notes. She had interviewed dozens of tourists over the years who had gotten carried away trying to create memorable content, but few had escalated their behavior as far as Marcus had. "Were you aware that interfering with a Queen's Guard in the performance of their duties is a criminal offense under British law?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. I knew they weren't supposed to move or talk, but I thought it was just like a tradition thing, not actual law. I've seen hundreds of videos of people trying to make them laugh or react. I didn't think I was doing anything that different. The detective paused her note-taking and looked at him directly. Mr. Thompson, touching a serviceman's weapon is considered assault under our laws. When you did that twice, despite being warned, you crossed from harmless tourism into criminal behavior. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Assault? But I barely touched it. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone or steal anything. I was just being stupid. His voice cracked with emotion as the full weight of the legal terminology settled on him. Intent doesn't always matter in law, sir. What matters is your actions and their impact on others. Detective Williams had delivered this explanation countless times, but she never enjoyed watching young people realize how seriously their harmless mistakes would be treated by the legal system. Marcus buried his face in his hands. What happens now? Am I going to jail? Will this affect my visa? Can I even go home? The questions tumbled out of him frantically as worst-case scenarios flooded his mind. You'll be charged formally, and then you'll have a court appearance. Depending on how you plead and various other factors, you could face fines, community service, or potentially brief imprisonment. As a foreign national, yes, this could affect your ability to return to the UK in the future. The room fell silent except for the scratching of Detective Williams's pen and the distant sounds of the police station around them. Marcus felt smaller and more alone than he ever had in his life. His grand plan to revive his social media career had instead potentially destroyed his freedom and future travel opportunities. "Can I call my parents?" he asked, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Detective Williams nodded and arranged for him to make the call. Marcus dreaded having to explain to his mother and father what had happened, but he knew he couldn't face this alone. His hands shook as he dialed their number, calculating that it would be early morning in California. His mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Marcus? How's London, sweetie? Are you having fun?" The contrast between her happy tone and his current reality made Marcus start crying before he could even speak. "Mom," he managed between sobs, "I'm in really big trouble." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Marcus's life. His parents' voices shifted from confusion to shock to deep disappointment as he explained what had happened. His father, a retired teacher who had always emphasized respect for authority, was particularly shaken by his son's behavior. "Marcus, how could you be so disrespectful?" his father asked, his voice heavy with sadness. "Those guards are serving their country with honor, and you treated one like he was there for your entertainment." His mother was more practical, immediately asking about legal representation and bail, but Marcus could hear the tears in her voice. "We'll figure out how to help you," she promised. "But son, you need to understand that this is going to have consequences that last long after you come home." After the call ended, Marcus sat alone in the holding cell, replaying every decision that had led him to this moment. He thought about Sergeant Mitchell, whose dignified service he had mocked and disrespected. He thought about the other tourists who had watched his behavior with growing discomfort, and the children who had been pulled away from his inappropriate display. For the first time, Marcus began to truly understand that his actions hadn't just been about him and his desperate need for online fame. He had disrupted other people's experiences, disrespected someone who was simply doing his job with pride and dedication, and embarrassed his country in front of international visitors. The viral fame he had sought was indeed coming, but not in any way he had imagined. Videos of his arrest were already spreading across social media platforms, shared by the many tourists who had witnessed his downfall. But instead of celebrating his boldness, viewers were criticizing his arrogance and stupidity. Comments on the videos ranged from harsh mockery to expressions of sympathy for Sergeant Mitchell, who had maintained his professionalism even while being publicly humiliated by an attention-seeking tourist. Marcus realized that in trying to make the guard look foolish, he had only succeeded in making himself appear small and pathetic. 3 days later, Marcus stood in Westminster Magistrates' Court wearing the same clothes he had been arrested in, now wrinkled and stale. His parents had managed to hire a local solicitor, Margaret Henley, an experienced woman in her 50s, who specialized in helping tourists navigate the British legal system. "The good news," Mrs. Henley had told him earlier that morning, "is that this is your first offense, and you're showing genuine remorse. The bad news is that the incident was very public and involved disrespect to the Crown, which British courts take seriously." As Marcus waited for his case to be called, he observed other defendants and began to realize how many people found themselves in legal trouble for momentary lapses in judgment. A young woman was there for shoplifting, an elderly man for a traffic violation, and a group of university students for public disturbance. Each person looked as worried and regretful as he felt. When his name was called, Marcus walked to the defendant's dock on unsteady legs. The magistrate, an elderly woman with kind but stern eyes, reviewed his file while the courtroom remained silent. Marcus could feel the weight of everyone's attention on him, but this time it brought only shame instead of the excitement he had felt while live streaming. The prosecutor, a young man who looked barely older than Marcus himself, stood to present the charges. "Your Honor, the defendant willfully interfered with a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces in the performance of his ceremonial duties and committed assault by twice touching the serviceman's weapon despite clear warnings to desist." Marcus listened to the formal language describing his actions and barely recognized himself in the prosecutor's words. The legal terminology made his behavior sound calculated and malicious, rather than the desperate attempt for attention it had actually been. Mrs. Henley stood to respond. "Your Honor, my client is a young American tourist who made a serious error in judgment. He deeply regrets his actions and wishes to offer a sincere apology to Sergeant Mitchell and to the court. This was not malicious behavior, but rather the foolish mistake of someone who didn't understand the seriousness of his actions." The magistrate looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, how do you plead to these charges?" Marcus had rehearsed this moment with his solicitor, but his voice still cracked as he spoke. "Guilty, Your Honor. I'm very sorry for what I did." "Mr. Thompson," the magistrate said, her voice carrying decades of judicial authority, "do you understand that the Queen's Guard serves an important ceremonial and security function, and that your behavior showed profound disrespect not only to Sergeant Mitchell personally, but to the institution he represents?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, meaning it completely for the first time since this ordeal began. The magistrate continued, "Tourism is important to our country, and we welcome visitors who come here with respect and appreciation for our culture and traditions. However, we cannot tolerate behavior that treats our servicemen as entertainment or shows such blatant disregard for our customs." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I understand, Your Honor. I'm deeply ashamed of how I acted." Mrs. Henley presented character references from Marcus's parents and former employers, emphasizing his lack of previous criminal behavior and his genuine remorse. She also submitted a written apology that Marcus had prepared, addressed both to Sergeant Mitchell and to the people of Britain. The magistrate reviewed the documents carefully before delivering her sentence. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sentencing you to 100 hours of community service to be completed during your remaining time in the UK, plus a fine of $2,000. Additionally, you are banned from all royal properties and ceremonial sites in the United Kingdom." The sentence was actually lighter than what Marcus had feared, but the reality of spending weeks doing community service instead of enjoying his planned vacation hit him hard. More significantly, the ban from royal properties meant he could never return to some of the most famous landmarks in Britain. After the hearing, Mrs. Henley explained that Marcus had been fortunate to receive community service rather than jail time. "The magistrate could have been much harsher," she told him as they walked down the courthouse steps. Your genuine remorse made a real difference. That afternoon, Marcus began his community service at a London food bank, helping to sort donations and prepare meals for distribution. The work was physically demanding and far removed from the glamorous image he had tried to project online, but it gave him time to think about his actions and their consequences. Working alongside longtime volunteers, Marcus heard stories about real hardship and struggle that put his own problems into perspective. An elderly volunteer named George, who had served in the Royal Navy decades earlier, was particularly impactful. "Young man," George said during a lunch break, "I heard about what happened at the palace. You know, I served alongside men like that. Guard. They take their duty seriously because they're representing something bigger than themselves." Marcus nodded, feeling fresh shame wash over him. "I don't know what I was thinking. I just wanted people to notice me, and I ended up hurting someone who didn't deserve it." George studied Marcus's face for a moment. "The measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes, son. It's what he does after he realizes he's made them. You've got a chance here to show what you're really made of." Those words would stick with Marcus through the remainder of his community service. Each day of sorting food donations and helping serve meals to people who truly needed assistance taught him something about service, humility, and finding purpose beyond seeking attention from strangers online. On Marcus's final day of community service, exactly 6 weeks after his arrest, he received an unexpected message through Mrs. Henley. Sergeant James Mitchell had agreed to meet with him for the personal apology Marcus had been requesting through his solicitor. Marcus arrived at a quiet cafe near Wellington Barracks 30 minutes early, his hands shaking with nervous energy. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say hundreds of times, but worried that no words could adequately express his regret for the humiliation he had caused. When Sergeant Mitchell entered the cafe, Marcus was struck by how different he looked in civilian clothes. Without his ceremonial uniform, he appeared younger and more approachable, though his military bearing remained unmistakable. He was tall and fit, with kind eyes that seemed at odds with the stern figure Marcus remembered from that terrible day. "Sergeant Mitchell," Marcus stood up quickly, extending his hand awkwardly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me. I know you didn't have to do this." The sergeant shook his hand firmly but didn't smile. "Please, call me James. I'm off duty." He sat down across from Marcus, his posture straight and attentive. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure I wanted to meet with you, but my wife convinced me it might be worth hearing what you had to say." Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat. The fact that this man's wife had to convince him to give Marcus a chance only emphasized how badly he had handled everything. "James, I need you to know that I am deeply, truly sorry for what I did that day. I disrespected you, your service, and everything you stand for. There's no excuse for my behavior." James studied Marcus's face carefully, looking for signs of sincerity. "Why did you do it? I've dealt with thousands of tourists over the years, and most understand that we're doing a job. What made you think it was acceptable to treat me like I was there for your entertainment?" The question hit Marcus hard because it forced him to confront the ugly truth about his motivations. "I was desperate," he admitted. "My social media career was failing, I was running out of money, and I thought if I could create something viral, it would solve all my problems. I saw you as a prop for my content, not as a real person with feelings and dignity." James nodded slowly. "Do you understand what that uniform means to me? What the ceremony and tradition represent?" Marcus had spent weeks researching this during his community service, trying to understand what he had mocked. You're not just standing there for tourists. You're honoring centuries of service to the crown and country. You're carrying on traditions that connect the present to history, and I turned it into a joke." "That's right," James said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine hurt. "Every time I put on that uniform, I'm representing every soldier who served before me and everyone who will serve after. When you mocked me, you were mocking all of them." Tears began rolling down Marcus's face. I know I can never undo what I did, but I want you to know that these past weeks have changed me. Working at the food bank, meeting people who actually serve others instead of just serving themselves, it's shown me how selfish and shallow I'd become. James's expression softened slightly. I heard about your community service from the court liaison officer. She said you've been one of the most dedicated volunteers they've had in years. Marcus wiped his eyes with his napkin. It's the first time in years I've done something that actually mattered. Something that helped people instead of just trying to get attention for myself. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the weight of the conversation. Finally, James spoke again. Marcus, I want you to understand something. What hurt me most wasn't the interference with my duties. I've dealt with worse. It was the complete lack of respect for what I was doing and why I was doing it. I understand that now, Marcus replied. I spent so much time thinking about myself and my problems that I forgot other people have dignity and purpose that I was trampling on. James leaned forward slightly. The question is, what are you going to do with this experience? Are you going to go back to California and return to the same behavior that brought you here, or are you going to let this change you? Marcus had been thinking about this question every day for weeks. I'm done with social media as a career. I've already deleted most of my accounts. When I get home, I'm going to look into working for a nonprofit or maybe going back to school to study social work. I want to spend my life helping people instead of using them for content. For the first time since sitting down, James smiled slightly. That sounds like you've learned something valuable from this experience. The most valuable lesson of my life, Marcus agreed. And James, I know this might sound strange, but thank you for not letting me get away with what I did. If you had just ignored me, or if the police had let me off with a warning, I probably would have kept making the same mistakes. Having real consequences forced me to confront who I had become. James extended his hand across the table. I accept your apology, Marcus, and I hope you do find a way to make a positive difference in the world. As they shook hands, Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he had been carrying since that morning at Buckingham Palace. He couldn't undo his mistakes, but he finally understood the path forward. 6 months later, Marcus would send James a letter from California, where he was working at a Veterans Assistance Center while taking night classes in social work. The letter included a photo of Marcus helping elderly veterans with their benefits applications, along with a note, "Thank you for showing me what real service looks like." James would frame that letter and keep it on his desk, a reminder that even the worst mistakes could sometimes lead to genuine growth and redemption.